Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about the Honduran model of a 1934 rifle made by Remington, and no, this is not a sporterized 1917 or P14. Now before we talk about the 1934, we're going to go back in history and we're going to give this rifle some historical context. Now most people know that Remington, they made the P14 rifle for the British, and then later they made the United States rifle caliber 30 model of 1917. For the Americans, which is just, you know, the P14 rifle, but in 30-06, essentially. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily realize that World War I ended pretty abruptly for a lot of the arms manufacturers. A lot of them had production really ramped up in 1918, and Remington, with their two factories that were producing the 1917, was pretty much in the exact same boat. They didn't need to make 1917 rifles anymore. That wasn't the official rifle of the US military. They're just pretty much stuck with a whole lot of manufacturing capability and a whole lot of parts from World War I contracts. So Remington, in 1921, using a lot of these spare parts, they introduced the Remington Model 30, which is a little like misnomer. You'd think like Remington Model 30, 1930. But the Remington 30 was introduced in 1921, and it was just essentially a sporterized sort of 1917. They did quite a few changes from the original 1917 design. So one of the key changes they made in the beginning was they removed the rear aperture sight. They shrunk the magazine down to just 5 rounds. It got rid of that pot belly. Knurling was added to the top of the receiver bridge and receiver ring. And then later on, they actually changed it to cock on open. Most people know that the P14 and the 1917 are cock on closed, just like the Lee Enfield rifles. And Remington changed that to cock on open for the American market because most American shooters were used to cock on open from Mauser style rifles. So they switched to cock on open, and then they started also drilling the sides of the receiver bridges for it's their Lyman's like 48 peep sight. So now we got to talk about Honduras. So Honduras is a small country in Central America, and they have been going through quite a few sort of internal conflicts. They had 2 civil wars. The first one was 1919 to 1920, and the second one was in 1924. In 1928 to 29, there's a rebellion, and then in 1932 there was a military coup in Honduras. So whenever there's conflict and wars and stuff like that, you know, arms makers they make guns for the conflict. And so somehow Remington got a contract for Honduras to make a military rifle for them. I'm not exactly sure how they got the contract and why Honduras went for like a Remington sort of rifle, like a 1917 derivative, instead of a Mauser rifle, because pretty much a lot of their neighbors, countries around them, were using Mauser rifles or Mauser derivatives. I guess the 1917, that family of rifles is kind of a Mauser derivative itself, but somehow Remington got this contract. Now it's a pretty small contract. I've read online where people say 3,000 or 3,500. I'll make my case on a little bit of why I think it's more than 3,000, probably at least 3,500. Now here at the 1917 and 1934 side by side, you can see a lot of the key differences between the two rifles. Probably the most obvious is the omitting of this rear aperture sight on the 1934. This is much more just kind of standard, you know, Mauser style of a receiver ring. It's just cut flat. If you zoom in here a little bit, you can see these 2 holes that they drilled into the receiver ring in the later Model 30s. For the Lyman rear sight, now these receivers were just drilled for that Lyman rear sight for the Model 30, the commercial rifle. And that carried over. They used the same receivers here with the model of 1934. So this is actually a feature from the 1930. You'll see that on these 1934s. Another one of the more notable features, you kind of have to look for it, but it's the elimination of this kind of pot belly magazine, kind of what everyone says about the P14 1917, has this pot belly magazine that's much more flat and smooth. This looks a lot more kind of like a 1903, say. The pot belly swell, I guess they put it on the diet here, and this is only holds 5 rounds. Or in the 1917s, the magazine would hold 6 rounds. So they eliminated it to just the standard 5, shrunk it down. That saves a little bit of weight and girth and everything, shrinking it down. So that's one of the big changes that happened to the Model 30 that was carried over to the 1934. Now, as far as receiver markings go, there's not a whole lot. So right at the top, you have a model of 1934 Remington 7mm, and then if you keep rotating it, you also have the serial number there. So it's just kind of all meant to be read from the same kind of direction. You'd kind of expect that font to be upside down so you could read it from this side of the rifle. But it's all meant to be read from the left side of the rifle, apparently. But that's pretty much it. Just model number, maker, caliber, serial number, and that's it. So now touching on the total production number of these rifles. So the serial number on my rifle is 4250. So one might look at this and say this was the 4,250th rifle, right? But the thing is, Remington, they tended to start their serial production at 1,000, not at 1. So this kind of leads me to believe that this was maybe the 3,250th rifle. That's just kind of the only thing, other than, like, say they skipped serial numbers, like there's gaps in the serial numbers for 1934s because of some other production. But like, I don't think they had any concurrent contracts or anything for this. So I don't really know if they skip numbers. Now, what my sort of guess with this is that they started at 1,000. So the very first rifle was 1,001, and then that went up to 4,500. And so this was probably the 3,250th rifle of the contract. So that kind of makes me think that the contract was slightly more than 3,000, probably 3,500, something like that. Maybe more, maybe 4,000. I'm not sure. I can't find the hard number there, but it seems like online the consensus is like about 3,000 to 3,500. So I think that's a pretty good indicator that rifle production was probably around 3,500. Now, one of the more substantial differences on the 1934 versus the 1917 is the addition of this guide rib on the bolt, this Mauser style guide rib that is absent on the 1917 here. You can see it has the space underneath the extractor where one would go and where the original design it did go, but it is absent on the 1917. But you can see it here on the 1934. Now here's a bolt from a K98K to just sort of show you what the guide rib, how it works. So this was added actually on the Swedish contract of rifles, and then it was also put on all the German Mausers. So it's kind of most known on German Mausers, but this was a Swedish addition. Now the 1934 has this bolt guide, and all the bolt guide really does is, so whenever you work the action, you lift the bolt handle and pull the bolt backwards. Well, this guide rib engages with a cutout underneath this receiver bridge. And so as you're pulling the bolt backwards, if you kind of put any perpendicular pressure on the action, this will keep the bolt from wiggling as much and hold it in place more. In my experience, I think this actually does add a little bit more stability and can make the rifle faster firing if it's not kind of hanging up with any sort of, not perfect forward and backwards movement of the bolt whenever you're working the action. But it's just kind of neat that this was added to the Remington, Model 30, and then the 1934s that you don't see. But it is an actual improvement in some of the, earlier Mauser bolt evolution that you see added, much later. Now, as far as bolts go, there's very minimal differences on the two rifles. You'll notice that on the 1934 bolt here, the bolt is cocked, right? Because it cocks on open. So you can see the striker coming out of the back here. On the 1917, it's not cocked because it's cocked on close. So that's not pulled out. You also tell the difference with the guide ribs. And other than that, they are pretty dang similar looking. You know, there's not much difference with the case head diameter on these two bolts. So very, very similar bolts on these two rifles. Similar gas venting. There's actually an additional gas vent hole on the 1934 bolt here. You sort of have some of these indentations from the cock-on close nature of the bolt here. And just to show you a little bit of the difference here, here's a 1917, which everybody knows. Of course, this is cock-on close. There is a sort of last round hold open on the 1917, so you have to depress that if it's empty. And if you see the rear of the bolt there, you'll see the striker come out more as you push in, because this is a cock on close. Now the 1934 is cock on open. You'll see the striker pop out of the rear of the bolt there when I lift the handle. There we go, so now it's cocked. It's definitely a little more friction, could just be this example. And there is no last round hold open on this, so you can just chamber it on an empty magazine. And there you go. There's very little resistance at the end there, obviously, because it's cock on open. All the resistance was at the beginning. And there's the major differences. Now, how the 1934 got into the U.S. collector's market, I'm not really sure. This 1934 doesn't have any import marks on it, so I don't know when it was brought in or how. It's a little in like the rougher, typical kind of sort of condition that you find a lot of Latin American Mausers or surplus rifles in. So it kind of makes me think that this did go to Honduras and came back. I guess there is a possibility that maybe some of these were made by Remington and not sent over. So maybe this was one of the ones that stayed here. Not exactly sure. Now the overall feel of the 1934, it of course is very reminiscent of a 1917, right? But without that large rear aperture sight and with the, without that potbelly magazine, this is a pretty slick rifle. I think I prefer the 1934 over the 1917, with the exception of the sights. These rolling block style rear sights are not very good. Especially with the front blade being kind of a pretty sharp front blade. It's not the best sight picture, but overall, like handling wise, it's really good. It's kind of just a little bit lighter, a little bit easier to handle. Same barrel length as the 1917, so like you're not really saving that much weight there or handling there. It's kind of a long rifle. This is a little bit longer than like a typical short rifle, but it's a little bit shorter than a long rifle, so it's kind of a weird sort of gray area where like the 1917 and the 1934 fit. But in 7mm, I love 7mm Mauser. I think 7mm is a great overall cartridge, and it doesn't recoil very much, especially a longer, heavier sort of bolt action like this in 7mm recoils well. Everything about it's very nice. The thumb safety location, it's in a very nice location. I'm kind of lukewarm on the cock on close versus cock on open. The various bolt design changes in this does make the 1934 slightly less smooth than a 1917. I'll work the action here. It's not bad. I did recently clean this, and so it's still a little sticky. Not awful, but just not as fast or slick as maybe the 1917 was. So it's probably a slower shooting gun than the 1917. It still has the dog leg bolt, so I guess you could still, if you wanted to. But yeah, overall, fun gun. Like I said, very low production numbers on these. So there's not very many in the U.S., but it's a neat gun, and it's it's one of those guns that when people see this, they kind of assume that this is a sporterized a sporterized 1917, especially with the little rear aperture, you know, sight holes in this. You could probably, if you found a 1934, it may or may not be marked down, because somebody is going to think that a Bubba got a hold of this thing and put those little holes there. So you might be able to get a little cheaper. The 1934 is kind of the last gasp of, you know, that kind of Leonfield or you know, 1917 family of rifles as far as military contracts goes. This is really the last gasp of it. I mean, even after this, the Remington Model 30, I think it only went up. They changed the model designation, and I think they stopped manufacturing it in 1948, something like that. So they're not. There wasn't like a super successful line. Remington just sort of made them for a long time, mostly just because they had the parts and everything. It's not uncommon to find 1934s with U.S. you know, stamps and markings on the bolt, like 1934s being made with leftover World War I components on them. So it's kind of it's a neat gun. It's niche. You know, you kind of have to like weird guns to kind of want something like this. It's a neat experience. If you collect Latin American Mausers, or maybe you like Honduras or something like that, it's a cool one to have. Thank you for watching. I'll try to make some more videos here soon. Thanks. Oh,
beautiful eyes on.
I know. Oh, he's asleep, but this is my third son here, little baby William.